The narrative of Iraq, a land etched deep with the marks of antiquity, whispers tales of empires risen and shattered, a crossroads of civilizations where ambition and intrigue danced under the relentless desert sun. Its modern trajectory, however, finds its genesis in a moment of brutal upheaval, a day when the sands were stained crimson, forever altering the course of its destiny. To comprehend the nation's complex path, especially the ascent of a figure who would become synonymous with both power and infamy, one must journey back to that pivotal summer of 1958. The British presence in Mesopotamia, a presence woven into the very fabric of the region since the waning days of the Ottoman Empire, cast a long, intricate shadow. The First World War saw British forces, after initial setbacks against Turkish opposition, finally secure Baghdad in 1917. With the subsequent dismantling of the Ottoman dominion, Britain assumed the mantle of mandatory power, a role that extended across a vast swathe of the Middle East. From Palestine to Transjordan, and with significant influence over Egypt and the strategically vital Suez Canal, the empire wielded considerable sway, its interest intricately intertwined with the region's resources and geopolitics. In 1921, seeking to stabilize the newly formed nation of Iraq, the British, echoing a pattern employed in other corners of the globe, installed a monarch, Faisal I, a scion of the Hashemite family. Faisal, a Sunni Muslim ruling over a predominantly Shia population, hailed not from Iraq itself but from the Hejaz. Yet he possessed a vision of pan-Arabism, a dream of uniting Iraq, Palestine, Syria and Lebanon under his banner. This ambitious concept, while appealing to some, stirred unease amongst Shia leaders who feared being relegated to a minority within a greater kingdom. Nonetheless, Faisal proved an astute ruler, striving to bridge sectarian divides and recognizing the immense potential of Iraq's oil reserves, then largely under British control, to fuel the nation's economic ascent. He also endeavoured to fortify Iraq's armed forces, drawing upon British military expertise. By 1932, Britain had formally recognized Iraq's independence, albeit a qualified independence, as the empire maintained considerable influence over the government and retained a substantial military presence, drawn by the lure of the black stuff that comes out of the ground. Faisal's reign, however, was tragically curtailed. In 1933, at the age of 48, he passed away in Bern, Switzerland, leaving the throne to his son Ghazi. Ghazi, inheriting his father's pan-Arabist fervour, also harboured a desire to loosen the empire's grip on Iraq. He voiced support for annexing neighbouring Kuwait, a sentiment that would echo through history with tragic consequences. Yet, Ghazi's reign, like his father's, was destined to be short-lived. In 1939 he perished in a car accident at the young age of 27, an event shrouded in suspicion. Many Iraqis believed he had been assassinated on the orders of Prime Minister Nouri al-Said due to the king's insistence on annexing Kuwait, a move opposed by the empire. The throne then passed to Faisal II, a mere child of 3. With the young king unable to rule, his cousin, Prince Abd al-Ilah, was appointed regent. When global conflagration erupted, Iraq nominally aligned itself with the empire and its allies. However, simmering discontent within the army led to a coup in 1941, orchestrated by pro-German officers seeking complete independence. They hoped to achieve this with assistance from powers across the continent, aiming to expel the empire and dismantle the monarchy. Faisal II, Prince Abd al-Ilah, and Prime Minister al-Said were deposed and forced into exile. The empire reacted swiftly and decisively. British forces swiftly crushed the rebellion, ousted the European support and restored the regency. The young king spent his formative years in England, receiving an education at Harrow School alongside his cousin, Prince Hussein, who would later ascend the throne of Jordan. Upon his return, he displayed a keen interest in infrastructure projects and modernisation. In 1953, upon reaching adulthood, Faisal II assumed full power. However, the tide of pan-Arabism was rising, destabilising the region. inexperienced and reliant on the counsel of Prince Abdalillah and Prime Minister al-Said, Faisal found himself facing growing opposition. Pan-Arab nationalism, anti-empire sentiment, the spectre of communism, and stark economic inequalities created a volatile brew. The agreement signed by Prince Abdalillah in 1948, allowing for a perpetual British military presence, and subsequently affirmed by Faisal in 1955, fueled widespread protests. The empire's determination to control Iraq's oil fields, coupled with the widening gap between a privileged elite close to the throne and the rest of the population, fostered fertile ground for communist ideology. The winds of change, blowing fiercely across the Middle East, carried with them the spirit of liberation and self-determination. Egypt, under the charismatic leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, had become a beacon of pan-Arabism. In 1952, Nasser had overthrown the Egyptian monarchy. Then, in 1956, he boldly nationalised the Suez Canal, asserting Egyptian control over its revenues, prompting a military intervention by the Empire, France, and the nascent State of Israel. The Suez Crisis and its aftermath sparked widespread outrage. The 1948 Baghdad Pact, seen as a symbol of subservience to the empire, became a lightning rod for public anger. Many Iraqis began to view Faisal II as a puppet of foreign powers. In February 1957, a coalition of opposition groups known as the Front for National Union coalesced, uniting National Democrats, Independents, Communists, and members of the Ba'ath Party, a socialist pan-Arab political movement. Simultaneously, within the Iraqi officer corps, a clandestine organisation emerged, the Supreme Committee of Free Officers, modelled after the group that had propelled Nasser to power in Egypt. This was a grave threat to Faisal and his government. They would ultimately have to rely on the army to keep them in power if anything actually occurred. Attempts were made to appease disgruntled officers with perks, but were largely unsuccessful. On February 1, 1958, Syria officially merged with Egypt, forming the United Arab Republic UAR. The Iraqi government, however, refused to recognise the new state. Driven by familial ties between the Iraqi and Jordanian royal families, the two nations sought to forge a strong alliance of their own. On February 14, 1958, they declared the Arab Hashemite Union, also known as the Arab Federation. As Faisal was older than King Hussein, he became the head of state, with Hussein serving as his deputy. However, many Iraqis viewed this new alignment with suspicion, perceiving it as a manoeuvre to perpetuate British influence. Within the army and civil society, opposition to British domination and criticism of Faisal II and his Prime Minister grew. Plots to overthrow the government by force were hatched. The plotters sought to sever ties with the Empire and the United States, deeply resenting the pervasive control exerted over Iraq's government and economy, particularly in light of Egypt's successful expulsion of foreign influence. Even members of the Iraqi elite, especially army officers within the Free Officers movement, began to gravitate towards Nasser's brand of pan-Arabism. Prime Minister al-Said's position had been weakened by his support for the Empire and French intervention in the Suez Crisis. Iraq found itself increasingly isolated from other Arab nations. Nasser's announcement of the UAR provided the catalyst for revolution. Yemen soon joined the UAR as well. Attention then turned to Lebanon. Syria supported the Arab nationalist movement seeking to depose the pro-Western government. If Syria succeeded and Lebanon joined the UAR, Iraq and Jordan would be completely isolated. Consequently, the Iraqi Prime Minister began to provide military aid to the Lebanese government. However, when al-Said attempted to deploy Iraqi troops to Jordan, it proved a step too far. The Free Officers movement, led by Brigadier Abd al-Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdul Salam Arif, saw its opportunity. The orders issued to Iraqi units to reinforce Jordan provided the perfect cover to launch a coup. The 19th and 20th Brigades of the 3rd Infantry Division were to march towards Jordan, passing through Baghdad en route. The division's commander, Major General Ghazi al-Dagestani, remained loyal to Faisal II and was unaware that 2 of his senior officers were part of a plot to depose the king and government. Colonel Arif directed the 20th Infantry Brigade towards the capital, while Brigadier Qasim remained in reserve with the 19th Brigade. In the early hours of July 14, 1958, troops of the 20th Brigade seized Baghdad's main broadcasting station, transforming it into the coup's headquarters. Over the radio, Colonel Arif declared an end to imperialism, proclaimed a republic, and announced the end of the monarchy. An interim government, consisting of a 3-man committee, would be established until free elections could be organised. 2 groups of soldiers were dispatched, one to deal with the king, the other with his prime minister. Faisal II was at Al-Rahab Palace, the primary royal residence in Baghdad. The palace was guarded by an elite bodyguard unit, loyal to the monarch and theoretically immune to the revolutionary fervour sweeping the army. Within the palace were Crown Prince Abdalillah, his wife Princess Hayam, Abdalillah's mother Princess Nafisa, King Faisal's aunt Princess Abadiyah, other family members, and servants. There is some suggestion that Faisal received a warning of an impending coup from the British, though this cannot be confirmed. Al-Rahab Palace was not to be Faisal's permanent residence. A new palace was under construction, intended to become his home following his planned wedding to an Egyptian princess. It is often reported that Faisal II ordered his royal guard to offer no resistance. However, some accounts suggest that there was an exchange of gunfire between soldiers of the 20th Brigade and palace guards. Hearing the gunfire, Captain Abdul Sattar al-Abusi, an army officer stationed near Baghdad, gathered his men and headed to the palace, ordering them to join the fight. Abusi brought up an artillery gun, and some sources claim that either 4 shells or mortar bombs were fired at the palace. Negotiations ensued for the surrender of the royal guard and the fate of the royal family. The official story is that an agreement was reached. The royal family would surrender in exchange for assurances of safety and escort to another location. Amidst smoke and dust, Faisal II, accompanied by family members, servants, and 2 royal guard officers, emerged into the royal gardens. They were unarmed. 2 versions of what happened next exist. The plotters claimed they intended to exile Faisal and Abdalillah. However, many believe that the coup leaders intended to eliminate the royal family, ensuring that the empire could not restore the monarchy. Captain Abusi stepped forward and opened fire with his submachine gun. The 23-year-old king, who was scheduled to fly to Istanbul and then London that morning, was cut down, along with the others. Only Princess Hayam survived, wounded in the leg or hip, possibly due to the presence of her family's tribe among the soldiers. Controversy surrounds the condition of Faisal following the initial shooting. Some reports claim he died of his wounds in a car en route to the hospital. However, Princess Hayam stated that Captain Abusi finished off Faisal and Abdalillah with pistol shots to the head. Princess Hayam maintained that the soldiers deliberately opened fire on the royal family and that Abusi delivered the coup de grace. The surviving and deceased members of the royal family were bundled into cars destined for the Ministry of Defence. However, along the way, the corpses of the king and crown prince were dumped in the street, where mobs defiled them. Faisal was stripped naked, and his body reportedly hung from a lamppost. Abdalillah, considered a traitor for his dealings with the empire, was dragged through the streets before his remains were hung from a balcony. The bodies were eventually taken to Al-Rashid Military Hospital for identification. That evening, a hole was dug near the hospital, and Faisal II's corpse was unceremoniously dumped in it. The rest of the dead were cremated, and their remains were cast into the Tigris River. Prime Minister Nuri al-Said was apprehended while attempting to escape and executed. His corpse was also abused by a mob. During Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, Faisal II's corpse was disinterred and reburied under a marble tomb in the restored royal cemetery in Baghdad. The coup caught the Western powers by surprise. Brigadier Qasim became Prime Minister and Minister of Defence, while Colonel Arif became Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior. the new government severed ties with the Empire and the United States, forging alliances with countries including the Soviet Union. In 1963, Qasim was overthrown in a coup by the Ba'ath Party. Thousands of left-wing Iraqis were killed. Arif launched a counter-coup later that year. The Iraqi Ba'ath Party seized power in 1968, and Saddam Hussein, a rising figure within the party, became vice president. He nationalized the Iraqi Petroleum Company and oversaw the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War. In 1979, Saddam seized power, purged the Ba'ath Party, invaded Iran in 1980 and Kuwait in 1990, triggering the First Gulf War. The assassination of Faisal II and his family on July 14, 1958, paved the way for Saddam Hussein's rise. Whether Faisal could have averted this outcome, and whether his rule was better or worse than what followed, remains